going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about one of the most highly anticipated films of 2024, at least for me and I know some others, and that film is called Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Once again, directed by Jeff Fowler, this film has a returning cast of people like Ben Schwartz, Idris Elba, Jim Carrey, James Marsden, and many others, and of course stars Keanu Reeves as Shadow the Hedgehog. So here we are now talking about the third installment into the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. I've been covering this franchise now since the early days of my time on YouTube, before I had a mic, before I had a lighting system here, and before I was any good at really doing this. I was raw dogging it in a lot of ways, but when I look back at those videos, it's kind of funny to see how time has passed since this franchise has been coming out with movies. Now, I don't want to regurgitate too much of what I've already said in those videos, but I grew up as a big fan of the Sonic franchise. I've been playing the games since back in the Sega Genesis days, and I played pretty much every installment in the franchise. So going into these movies, I was always very excited to see how they were done, and for the most part, I've enjoyed them. I could do without the human element, as I've felt the same way about the video games that have included humans. I think the best Sonic stories are the ones that take place in his world with the Sonic characters. I don't need humans involved, and so I feel the same way about this film right out of the gate, but we're going to get into all that in just a second. But I know a lot of people were excited going into this, just like myself, because the second film teased that Shadow the Hedgehog, now what we now know is played by Keanu Reeves, was going to be in this film, so the excitement was even more so. So before we get into all that, I want to say a big thanks to all of you guys for taking the time out of your day to watch one of my videos. If you're new to the channel, I want you to consider subscribing, as every week I have early reviews for movies and TV shows, as well as things like retrospective reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog. And if you're a returning viewer, well, thank you so much for taking the time to come back and hear me talk about another movie. Sonic the Hedgehog 3, once again directed by Jeff Fowler, and when I heard he was coming back, I thought, all right, cool. I really enjoyed what he did with the first two. It's nice to see a director stick around for a whole trilogy. Usually kind of allows it to have a little bit more of a unified vision, and I think that that's definitely something this film benefits from, is kind of seeing where he wanted to go with these films. Now, before we get into my thoughts on the film, let's talk about what this movie is all about. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 opens up and we are instantly introduced to the fact that Shadow has been imprisoned for about 50 years or so, and he is now being released by a second Robotnik. There are two Robotniks in this film. Jim Carrey is playing two characters, the Robotnik that we were following in the previous two films, the main villain, and this time around a new threat that arises, who is the grandfather of the Robotnik we've been following. So now the two of them are working together with Shadow to try to, do their evil masterminding, while Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles must work together to try to find a way to stop them. There's more that goes on, but that's the general gist of the film. And I'll start this off by saying that I think a lot of people are going into this to see Shadow the Hedgehog. And as a longtime fan of the character, he's without a doubt the most iconic villain in the Sonic franchise, and he's without a doubt one of the most iconic video game villains of all time. So I think a lot of people are really excited to see him in this film. And what I can say about his character is I think he's handled very well. I think Keanu Reeves is the perfect guy to play our edgelord and savior out here. I think he brings everything that you want Shadow to bring. He's got the guns, he's got his motorcycle, he's got that badass kind of like storyline, he's got that cool vibe to him, he's that tortured soul. And I think for the most part, when it comes down to the Shadow moments in this film, it's really solid. There's also some epic action between him and Sonic, most notably in the finale, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. I do have some gripes on him, and we'll get into that in just a second, but for the most part, when it comes down to Shadow, I think that you are going to be very pleased if you're going into this as a fan of the character. Now, when it comes down to the overall film, what I can say is that similar to the last two films, that whimsy and that endearing quality when it comes down to Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and the various characters in their world, that's still very present here. That overall charm, a lot of the humor that comes from those characters, and the banter is very present, and all that big, fun, vibrant, colorful CGI action that you come to these films for is very present. I think all the elements that a lot of people love about the first two when it comes down to the Sonic and his pals element is very, very present here, and you're going to have a good time with all that. As a longtime Sonic fan, and as a fan of what they did with the last two in terms of the Sonic action and the visuals, I was very, very pleased by a lot of the moments that happened in this film. There was definitely a lot of crowd-pleasing moments that are going to give you chills if you're a longtime fan of the franchise, and stuff that'll put smiles on your faces. There's also tons of Easter eggs, hints, and nods to the overarching world of the Sonic universe, as well as some nice teases in that mid-credit scene for what's to come that got the theater that I was in erupting in excitement, and I was very excited as well. I definitely got chills during the mid-credit scene. So there was definitely the stuff that really worked in this film. With all that said, I'm a little bit torn on the film, I won't lie, and I'm a little disappointed to say that because I really enjoyed the first film. I enjoyed the second one a little bit less, but I think all the Sonic elements, especially with the introduction of Knuckles in that film and Tails, I thought all of that was done even better, and I thought that the Sonic elements of that film were better, but I thought the story was lacking a little bit more in the second one. And unfortunately, I think it's a little bit of diminishing returns in the story with this one here. I think the narrative of this film, unfortunately, is pretty hollow for majority of the time, and it's kind of convoluted in a lot of ways. There are a lot of moments in the earlier part of the film where it feels like the film is kind of struggling to find its footing on what it really wants to focus on. There's a lot of characters, there's a lot of things going on, and I don't necessarily know that everything kind of gets perfect servicing to it all. I think some of those things end up falling to the wayside, and that really comes down to a lot of the human characters in the mix. You know, you have Robotnik as the main villain, the two Robotniks, and they spend a lot of time with them in the film, so they're the human characters that spend the most time with in the film. But when it comes down to returning characters that like James Marsden and Tika Sumpter play, the characters of Tom and Maddie, who are essentially like Sonic's parents, they're essentially relegated to only like 3 sequences in the film, with only one of those really mattering, that kind of like ups the stakes for Sonic, you know, in terms of like him having to protect his family. Outside of that, it kind of felt like they were just there. There wasn't really an abundance for them to do. They weren't really given much on a writing level that ever allows them to elevate the material. They're fun. I think they're cute characters, but there wasn't really an abundance given to them to really make them characters that were worthwhile. Agent Stone is in this film again, and they try to, you know, make some emotional ties with him and Dr. Robotnik, but again, another character that I think is kind of falling to the wayside of this film. And a character that did kind of fall to the wayside in a lot of ways that kind of broke my heart is the character of Shadow the Hedgehog. I wanted to talk about all the things that I think they did right earlier, because I do think the moments with him in the badass action, the moments with between him and Sonic are amazing, especially in the finale, and we're going to get into that in a second. But there's a chunk of this film where it just feels like he is that really strong weapon character that the two Robotniks are kind of holding in their back pocket, kind of a bodyguard character for whenever Sonic and the rest of the gang appear. There's a big chunk of the film where it feels like they aren't doing enough with him, and by the time we got to the end, while it's a very satisfying finale as a fan of the franchise, there was a part of me that was just like, man, I almost wish they would have done more with Shadow. I wish that Shadow had been the main villain, but instead we have another film where Robotnik is the main villain of the story, and since we have 2 Robotniks, there's 2 Robotniks that are the main villains of this story. And it feels like Shadow is just kind of that really strong henchman that's kind of along for the ride. Again, I don't want to sit here and say that he doesn't have incredible moments to shine, but I do think there's a section there in that middle portion of the film where I just kept clamoring for a little bit more Shadow. And when it comes down to the overall story, I just think it was kind of messy. I don't think it was a very overly compelling story. There wasn't really a plot that I found myself overly invested in. It felt very cookie cutter, and I kind of felt the same way about the last film, but I felt like the last one had a little bit more focus with where it was going and spent more time with the character of Sonic and the rest of the gang in a way that allowed it to kind of be passable. It was never something that bothered me too much because I found it was just a good fun time. In the case of this one, we spend so much time with the Robotniks in this film to the point where it was a little bit annoying at a certain point. I love Jim Carrey, but I do think the humor in this film for me was a little bit hit or miss. There is some great fun humor when it comes down to Sonic, Knuckles, and Tails, and Shadow. There's some great banter between those characters, some, you know, pop culture references that are made that made me chuckle. There's a lot of little, you know, endearing, charming, humorous moments between some of those characters. But there's also a lot of humor in this film that I thought maybe went a little too far. There was some humor in this film that for me just felt like they were forcing funny instead of actually being funny. And when you have somebody like Jim Carrey, he's so good at being funny in this big, over-the-top, incredibly just bombastic way. In certain moments in this film, it certainly works. You know, he's definitely giving us those Jim Carreyisms that we know and love. And I love Jim Carrey, so there's definitely moments where I was appreciating all the big over-the-top slapstick humor that he was doing. But at a certain point, over an hour into the film, there was just so much humor that just felt like it was detracting from the story, that it felt like it was detracting from the stakes. When it comes down to Sonic the Hedgehog, you want humor, you want silliness, you want there to be some laughable elements to the film. You want to be able to feel like you're having a good time. And I just feel like, unfortunately though, they took the wrong lessons from what's come before, because in the Sonic franchise and in the lore, there are some really serious stories as well. There's some pretty dark elements, and this film touches on some of those things, especially around the character of Shadow the Hedgehog. They pull from games like the Sonic Adventures games and a couple others to kind of piece this story together, and I feel like they kind of breeze past some of those darker elements and lean so heavily into the comedy at times that oftentimes it just kind of undercut what was happening in the film. And by the time we got to the end, I ultimately found that a lot of the overall narrative was kind of muddled and just okay. There wasn't really anything about it that had me clamoring to see where it was gonna go. I was just excited for the action. And so I feel like it's important to say, I thought that the story was a bit of a mess here and that the humor was very hit or miss for me, leaning more on miss than it was hit. There was plenty of moments that I laughed and chuckled though. I don't want to sit here and pretend that this was a snore fest because I did have fun watching the film, but there were elements about the story that undeniably for me were just messy. In comparison to the first two, I think this is probably the weakest story that we've had in one of these films yet, unfortunately. Now, when it comes down to the visuals and the action, I think all that's great, and I want to make it abundantly clear that they were absolutely going for giving you everything that you want to see in the final act of this film, most notably the final 30 minutes. The final showdown between Sonic and Shadow is absolutely incredible. There are some beautiful action shots and all of that. The overall aesthetic of everything is incredible. They touch on elements of the Shadow and Sonic lore that are going to put fans in a very, very happy state. I thought that the entire finale of this film was essentially built to make you forget about any gripes you may have had earlier in the film. Anything struggles that you had with the film earlier in terms of story and structure and humor, all of that I feel like it's kind of easily distractible as you get to this big final action sequence that is just huge. It's crazy, it's over the top, it's visually a spectacle. These characters are badass. And as a longtime fan of the franchise, I was undeniably in love with seeing all that. But unfortunately, I don't necessarily know if I think it saved the movie for me entirely. What I can say about the film is I didn't love it. I went into it really hyped. I wish they did more with the character of Shadow, but I thought the visuals and the action was incredible, but that the story and the humor just held this film back from being great to just being something that I liked. I enjoyed it. I would watch it again. That mid-credit scene has me excited for whatever they have in store for the fourth film in the franchise. I think there's a lot of potential with the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise on the big screen. But I honestly think that this film for me really showcased, when it comes down to characters like James Marsden and Tika Sumpter, and even with Jim Carrey in the mix, that the best stories with these characters are the characters and the stories that take place in Sonic's world with the Sonic characters. I don't want any more human characters in these stories. Obviously Robotnik's a different case, but there was double Robotnik in this film, and at times I do think it was a little bit too much. I do think it kind of undercut what could have been a great Sonic versus Shadow storyline, and unfortunately I felt like it undercut Shadow as kind of a secondary villain instead of the main villain that he should have been in this film. So yeah, as you can tell, I'm a little bit torn. This is one of those reviews where it's not like, hey, this is a great movie, go check it out, here's some gripes, here's the positives that I have, but I think you'll really love it. This is one that I think some people are going to walk out incredibly pleased because that last bit of the movie is so satisfying and so just like visually stimulating that you're gonna walk out of the film and just be like, oh my god, that finale was beautiful. But there's also gonna be a lot of people who come out of this film who are not big Sonic the Hedgehog fans, who are big movie fans and are hoping for a good story. We're probably gonna walk out and say that was some pretty cool fun action, it was very vibrant and visually cool, but I don't have the connection to the lore and to these characters and to the nostalgia, so the story and the humor just didn't work for me. I can genuinely see that kind of being something, but based on the response of the people that were in the theater I was in, there were some people cheering, but I also heard some people just saying that they thought it was just okay on the way out. So I think this is going to be a divisive film, and as a big fan of the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, it left me feeling divisive. It made me kind of feel torn about the film. I wish I could tell you, hey, listen, it wasn't the best, but it was a fun time, go watch it. I do think it's fun. I do think it's got some really incredible action, but I do think that the story is pretty weak. I'm not gonna lie, I think the story is flat out pretty weak, and I think the humor honestly sometimes was kind of cringe and just too much. It just felt forced humor. So I'm gonna stop rambling and repeating things now, but a big thanks to you guys for watching. Hit that like button if you guys enjoyed the video, consider subscribing if you guys like early reviews like this, and drop some comments down below. What are you guys thinking about this film? Are you looking forward to checking it out? If you already saw it, what did you think about it? Whatever the case may be, I'll see all of you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.